Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, I can tell it's going to be a good night already because I've been promoted within the first 10 minutes, but thank you. Thank you very much for everyone to come along. We've got a wonderful event tonight. We're talking about 2024 as a year of global elections. Personally, I'm a scholar of contemporary French history, and so you can already tell that it's a conclusive year, surely, for elections, and a rare moment of stability in France. We were saying, just Monday, another no-confidence vote, and yet the government has survived again. Now, I think it's really important for us to think about this idea of the elections that took place. Over 20 countries took to the polls. We had a swathe of different elections. It's very difficult, I think, to draw these sort of macro conclusions that fit everything. And so what we've done is tried to bring together some questions that were submitted in advance. There were loads of questions. So we tried to take some specific themes and draw them together in order to put it, about the idea of the health of democracy. This is part of the series of the age of mistrust. And we've got some wonderful speakers to answer those questions in general. Now, I was rereading recently a wonderful book by Malcolm Crook, which is about how the French learned to vote. And in it, he talks about this he does a lot of work with spoiled ballot papers. And in 1898, he had this one spoiled ballot paper where it spoke about the idea that the person they were voting for would make them anonymous king for a day. I think one of the things you think about in elections, there's almost that sense. Everyone becomes the anonymous king for a day to vote. We can talk about, electoral backsliding, enthusiasm for elections, but ultimately it has at the heart of it that power, And I think that's one of the things we're hopefully going to try and do, talk about these elections. It's difficult. We're going to try and sound hopeful, perhaps, or maybe just cynical about the outcomes. Now, without any further ado, I want to, of course, introduce our speakers. Professor Sara Hobolt is the Sutherland Chair in European Institutions and Professor in Department of Government at the London School of Economics. Previously, she held posts at the University of Oxford and the University of Michigan, and she was made Fellow of the British Academy in 2017. She's published extensively on elections, referenda, public opinion, and European politics. Next, Professor Ben Ansell is Professor of Comparative Democratic Institutions at Nuffield College at the University of Oxford. Born in California, he grew up in the UK before returning to the US for his postgraduate studies in political science at Berkeley, followed by a PhD at Harvard. He taught at the University of Minnesota and became full professor in Oxford in 2013. He's made Fellow of the British Academy in 2018, and his work's been widely covered across the media. And we also have Dr Pavithra Suryanarayan, who is Associate Professor in Department of Government at the London School of Economics. Some wonderful work on state capacity, redistributive politics, as well as vote choice in ranked societies like India and the United States. Again, Pavitra's work's been covered widely in the media, and she's won discipline-wide awards. She was also Assistant Professor at Johns Hopkins University and completed her PhD at Columbia. So that's all the introductions out of the way. And I'll dive straight into the questions in that case. Now, what I wanted to do first of all, if we start with some of the big trends, perhaps, that we've seen in this past year of elections. I wondered, we can go around and maybe just have a couple of bit of a discussion. Do you see any common trends in terms of voter behaviour? Maybe across your specialist areas. Do you think 2024 was a good year for democracy in terms of voter engagement? What do we think? Sarah, perhaps I could start with yourself.
So my geographical focus, of course this has been a year of elections everywhere, but my own geographical focus is really on Europe. And we've had quite a few elections in Europe, but we've also had the European Parliament elections, which is where now 27 member states go to the polls. And that allows us to kind of have a snapshot of what's really happening across the continent. And it won't come as a surprise, I'm sure, to anyone in the audience, that the key trend and the key talking point was really that of the continued rise of the far right. So that used to be a sort of phenomenon we've had in some European countries, but what we're seeing now is they're really on the rise in almost every member state of the European Union, and it's a sort of trend that we've had the last two European Parliament elections. Before that, there was also a shift to the right, and that's continuing. So that's the sort of really the big theme, also partly because we've seen it also reflected in national elections. So it's not just a sort of protest, or these are second-order, less important elections. It's really also a trend we're seeing now with populist right-wing parties in government in countries like the Netherlands, Italy, Hungary, and so on. So it's shifting politics away from a kind of dominance of the center in Europe to the far right becoming more influential.
A big trend. Ben, in terms of that, do you think that that dominant trend of a rise of the far right, displacement of the center that Sara described, is that something you'd see in those 2024 elections?
So, and I apologize for the quality of, although very low quality of my voice. It's been ravaged by illness. It's clearly a trend in Europe and elsewhere that populist politicians have done well over the last year. I don't think only over the last year. And if I had been giving this talk or having this conversation in October of last year, I might have said, well, you know what, a number of strongman rulers have done quite poorly over the previous 12 months. So, I mean, Pavi may want to talk about India, so I'll leave that. But in Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's AKP party did very poorly in the city elections and the municipal elections in Istanbul and Ankara and Izmir and elsewhere. Just before 2024 began, the Law and Justice Party lost power in Poland. So I don't think there's a single story about the directionality of voting, that it's all moving to the right, although clearly over the past 5 years, populists have done far better than before. Last year was a terrible year to run for office. And, I'm very far from the only person to mention this. John Byrne Murdoch at the FT had a very viral graph that showed the decline or increase in vote that incumbents in major countries had over the past year and compared that to all years since the Second World War. And it was the only year where incumbents had declined in the vote in every single country. Right? So something general was going on. If you happen to be a strongman leader, that was bad. But by and large, populists aren't in power. Right? And so then they were the beneficiaries of the real high levels of dissatisfaction with incumbents. And we can talk about that, right? That might be that everybody's a natural populist, but it could just be that everybody hates inflation.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting trend, isn't it? Because one posits the idea of a kind of an advance of a certain type of politics, and the other a retreat from a kind of positional politics in that sense. Now, Pavithra, we mentioned that there, and Ben mentioned the idea of Modi and the idea of the results in India, and that's really something I think you can see there, a real sense of engagement.
Absolutely. I mean, India went to elections in April last year, and it did it over 7 phases. You cannot not be moved by the idea of 1 billion people turning up, nearly 1 billion voters showing up to vote. And going in, the party felt very rah-rah-rah. We're going to win 400 out of the 543 seats in parliament. It's going to be our year. And yet the voters showed them. And it was not a great performance for the party, even though it came back into power in a coalition government. It felt like a setback. And I would agree that if there is a common trend, it did seem to be a very bad year of elections and anti-incumbency. But in India, there was the simultaneous phenomenon of a 10-year far-right government having had its effect on institutions. And so, what was really surprising is that the voters were even able to get through this level of dissatisfaction into against a government when everything was stacked against them exercising that power. Because you now have a party that has managed to consolidate media, business, in almost every realm that you think you need for a thriving, functioning democracy. Things were against, the voters having the ability to dislodge the BJP, and yet they made their voices heard. So I think in a year of elections, that felt like a very hopeful sign that voters do get to have their say, even when things can be stacked against them.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a really hopeful message, I think. You look at, exactly as you're saying, those sort of regional spotlights, places like India or Ghana, where you see kind of positive electoral process, you see this engagement. That's a great sign, although you might then look at somewhere like Rwanda and say, well, 98% voter turnout. Really? It's not exactly necessarily a sign of a good thing, because you're talking about strongmen, Ben, and we know that strongmen can love an election. That doesn't preclude that idea, does it, in that sense? do you think there's something about youth as well? Is there you mentioned that idea of a kind of pushback against incumbents. Does that come with a generational thing, do you think? What do we reckon?
I would just say on youth, we in the UK have had an incredibly strong age divide in our voting over the last 5 or 10 years. There was a kind of ever-creeping northwards juncture point where people flipped from Labour to Conservative. It had been in their 40s, then their 50s, and by the last election it was among people of retirement age. And so eventually that worked out well for Labour, but it didn't earlier on because older people turn out to vote. That I don't think is as true elsewhere. And I think sometimes in the UK we try and impose the politics that's been going on here, where the youth divide has been so strong, to other countries. And in particular, we saw that relative to 2020 in the US, young people had shifted towards Donald Trump, not away from him. In France, we have the phenomenon that the Rassemblement National, that's Marine Le Pen's far-right party, are fairly popular, or no less popular at least, among the young than older citizens.
I mean, maybe Sarah, I could come to you then about that idea of looking at those bigger issues. You mentioned the European elections. Is there a generational effect on participation or voting patterns or anything really to do with those kind of supranational elections in that way, do you think?
Just finished the project looking over time at the youth vote in European Parliament election, and this is the first time, 2024, where young voters are more likely to vote for the radical right than older voters. Of course, that has been the case in certain countries before, but where we really see that consistently. So, as Ben said, quite a contrast to the UK, where it's sort of, but again, some of that is also a kind of anti-conservative vote, as opposed to. So, but the other thing, when you look into that, really, it's entirely driven by young men. So, two things: you have this sort of far right or populist right appealing to younger voters, but really young men, and that gender gap, which also, of course, we have in the US, is greater amongst younger voters. I don't think we as researchers necessarily have sort of fully established some of the causes of that, but it's certainly a pattern where you might think, oh, the gender gap would decrease over the years. You're seeing a kind of backlash amongst young men and an appeal of the far right.
And is that something, obviously we're talking about the Indian National Congress, the grand old party. Is there a youth surge for the grand old party?
Unlike much of the West, India is a very young country. And so the biggest chunk of the voting age population is relatively young. And many of them have only ever been enculturalized into voting with the BJP being in power. So if you're a new voter now, what you've seen for the past 10 years is this party gets stronger and stronger. Having said that, the BJP as a party has made an effort to court the young. So I would say India is a case where the right does very well with young voters, even women, because it offers pathways into being involved in party mobilization as women voters. And so, again, it's a case that upends a lot of what we think about who's attracted to the right. And here, both young and female voters are very much supporters of the BJP.
That's fascinating. And I saw a statistic as well that said, across the border in Pakistan, 10 million fewer women voted this time around last year than the previous. And, statistics like that are absolutely an indication of something decaying in that sense in terms of those electoral structures. So as you say, a hopeful message there. Yeah.
Yes, but on the other hand, I also want to point out that the BJP only got about a third of the vote share in India.
Okay.
And that's because it is a very diverse country in its federal structure. The large parts of the country where the BJP really hasn't made inroads. I come from one such state in the south where the BJP really doesn't exist as a political force. So when we talk about politics in India, I think one of the strengths of the country's political system is that it still has a very sort of federalized political party system, which allows for, a variety of different voices to still be heard, even as a party consolidates power at the center, which I think a number of other federal countries don't have. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. That idea around domestic politics, how we're framing things in that way is a really interesting one. Obviously, we see a lot of this in terms of it. And I wonder then I can move to our kind of second question that draws some of these things together. Pulling back from maybe the domestic views, politics, trends that we see in these elections. And especially with recent US politics in mind, it can seem, I think, sometimes, like there's something of a wider shift going on in global power balances, you know? And I wonder, do you see international politics having a strong influence on national elections? Are voters worried about the wider world, or are they just interested in their pocketbook? What do we think? Sarah, perhaps I'll come to you.
If you look at the issues that in a European context were sort of the top issues really across most of the continent, and also here in the UK, was really the economy and immigration. And on the one hand, that might seem that's not very international, but on the other hand, of course, it is.
Yeah.
You know, immigration flows were partly influenced by international conflicts in places like Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, but also, as Ben already mentioned, the economy and inflation were partly caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So in that sense, I mean, the world is now so interconnected. And also, if you look more broadly at what we've talked quite a bit about, this rise of the populist right, a lot of that is a sort of anti-globalization reaction. So it's not directly that people vote necessarily on one international hotspot, but it can be a reaction to this interdependence of our world. And then certain parties come and offer solutions that are saying, oh, you know, you're not going to be affected by all of this if you follow us. You can close your borders. You can live in a sort of more isolated bubble. So in that sense, I think international politics and global conflicts very much influence vote choices, but it's not necessarily what you see as the sort of top issue on parties' manifestos.
Gotcha. So in that case, a sort of something that shapes the gravity of the election rather than perhaps an election, manifesto promise in that case. Yeah. So kind of pouvoir d'achat in France, purchasing power, or I guess Trump always talked about groceries being the thing that got to people. Famously, the price of eggs in the US was one. What do you think, Ben?
So I think I'm going to answer this slightly differently, actually. Sorry, which is that I think there is an international force going on that we don't quite know how to get our heads around. And that's and this is me being a complete metropolitan elite and mentioning another Financial Times journalist within 10 minutes. Janan Ganesh had an interesting new phrase he created, the Nationalist Internationale. Right, so we said the old Internationale of Socialists in the late 19th century, all the socialist parties from across Europe meeting and debating at length about how they were going to overthrow the governments they never managed to overthrow. But there is Ganesh was saying there's a sort of Steve Bannon-esque nationalist international, and it's a bit paradoxical, right? How do communications between Orban and Le Pen and people around Trump and Farage and the AfD, I mean, some of these don't speak to one another, right? Farage clearly got very nervous about Tommy Robinson being mentioned by Elon Musk. But there is clearly communication and an international political movement across the far-right parties and to some degree across the center-right parties of Europe, North America, and beyond. I don't know what we should think of this or how tenable it is as a strategy, right? The socialists, the communists, at least had an internationalist ideology, right, that lay underneath this. That's true for liberals as well. That's not true for nationalists. And so it does make you wonder, is there an inherent limit to this? But right now, that seems to me to be a really interesting story to follow, especially as we're at kind of peak Trump vibes. Before the Trump administration falls off a cliff in terms of public opinion, which it absolutely might in the next year, this will be the time that message, you can see the Labour Party talking. A Labour MP mentioned to a journalist this weekend that they viewed Labour as having more in common with Trump's Republicans than Harris's Democrats, which is an incredible statement. So, we're in that zone right now.
Yeah, definitely an unnamed source on that one. It was,
that's
Yeah. So, front page of the newspaper, certainly in France, were Emmanuel Macron hugging Modi at this Paris AI summit. And how does that fit in?
So I was just going to go there. I think if you asked a certain strata of India, which is urban, sort of, outward-looking, works in financial services or IT, Modi to them represents what he calls Vishwagaru, which is like the guru of the world, a man of the world. And he's portrayed himself as somebody who has really excellent relations with world leaders and spends a lot of his time as prime minister being very outward facing. And so in some sense, he does a performance of being a strong international leader, which resonates with a certain strata of Indian society. But by and large, I think this past year was really a pocketbook election for many voters in India. There was terrible rural distress, high unemployment, high inflation, and especially in the parts of the country where the BJP had been traditionally very strong, which is the rural, heartland in North India. And so it was a real shock when the BJP underperformed those areas. I'm also going to say that that performative element of being this strong international leader, I think, worked against somebody like Biden. Ever since the Afghanistan pullout, there was this image that set in of, oh, he didn't know what he was doing, and he didn't have things under control, which cascaded all through to, the coverage on the Middle East towards the end of 2024. And so I do think there was an international element here, but in the way of how voters perceive the strength of their leaders' ability to perform, hit their control over the international arena, which worked in one leader's favor and not so much in the others, if you compare India and the US.
Yeah, I think that's an important one. That's a really useful way to link those, I think, as well, between those ideas of kind of surging, kind of right-wing, those kind of connections, but also, as you say, internationalism, but pocketbook politics as well. It's about that idea of perception, strength, those kind of useful, I think, then to think about this idea, where some of these ideas of those networks, that strength, come from. So if I shift on to question number 3 that we have, it's almost a decade now, really, since we started seeing the phrase fake news in political analysis. Since then, the spread of misinformation online certainly hasn't slowed down. Thinking about our year of global elections in sight in 2024, what sort of impact do you think technology has had? Will generative AI and large language models shape our future at the ballot box?
So I can comment on that because I talked this week to another fellow of the British Academy, Helen Margetts, who is one of the directors of the Turing Institute. And she and her colleagues had done a recent study on the influence of generative artificial intelligence, so ChatGPT and so on, across the year of elections, and the finding was essentially nil. It didn't have much of an effect. Now, it's not completely nil. They found that it is good at writing well-targeted and crafted get-out-the-vote messages, right? So, but that seems like the way that you or I might use it to come up with, ChatGPT, write me 150 slightly different invitations to a party that I'm having and merge mail them for me, please, right? I mean, great, that's useful, but it's not, I think, the kind of thing we were worrying about if we thought about influence in elections. There were some stories, I did a show with Stuart Russell, the artificial intelligence scholar, right at the end of 2023. We did a BBC thing with Katja Adler in the World Service about, what are the effects of AI going to be this year? And he was really quite worried. There were going to be the ability to have fake videos of people. There's going to be fake audio. There was fake audio, by the way, of Keir Starmer being rude to cleaners at the Labour convention, this conference, which did not apparently influence a single vote in the country. At the start of the year, there were some fake videos in Bangladesh, but that election was boycotted anyway. I mean, that election had so many problems. So I think, really, it's been a big damp squib. Now, it might not be in the future, but as long as artificial intelligence is basically large language models that are getting ever slightly better at imitating things, but not artificial general intelligence, which Sam Altman keeps promising us is just around the corner before the next quarterly earnings report, I don't think we have that much to worry about. I think it's another of the tricks of the trade that political consultants have always been good at.
Something there, I mean, Sara, we saw, was it yesterday, Emmanuel Macron again retweeted that video of himself edited into all different music videos, singing and saying, this is AI at work, fantastic. Now that's one thing. But then someone like Romania, of course, saw a very different type of technology shape the election in a different way. Is that right?
Yeah, I think one thing is AI, but the other thing is more generally that the sort of mainstream media landscape is sort of breaking down as the main source of information for people. And that provides opportunities, like we saw in the Romanian presidential election, for challengers who weren't even the sort of part of a presidential debate or anything like that, all of a sudden emerging as the top candidate. And I think generally if we look at the kind of challenger parties that have been very effective at using social media, or, you know, a kind of Donald Trump who might spend less money but going on the right kind of podcasts, and again going back to the whole question of the youth votes, I think we need more research on that, but one thesis is that some parties are just very good at targeting people, you know, the kind of places that maybe Ben, he's, you know, young man on TikTok, but I'm certainly not. But just today when I gave a lecture, some of my students were like, yeah, all they were getting at Freshers Week in terms of political targeting was Nigel Farage with a beer in his hand telling them, oh, you shouldn't be drinking during Freshers Week, haha. Like, no political message, but clearly he's using and targeting. And so one thing is AI, but another thing is just that the mainstream parties don't have the kind of control and influence the whole BBC balance who goes on, you know, in terms of the communication. I also think that if we're really sitting here, now I'm going to disagree slightly with Ben, and say, oh, it's all a damn squid. I think none of us honestly have any idea how our lives are going to change in the next 5-10 years in terms of AI. Like, I just don't think we know. I don't think even the people who are at the forefront of it quite know. So I'll sort of just, but I agree that in these elections, not in that way, but I think we just are not going to be able to know what information is, what's real or what's not real, and that's just one aspect of it.
Unanticipated spread, those different media that people access, the different networks. Absolutely, I think that's a really interesting point. Is that something, I mean, you talked about India's electorate of, you know, nearly 1 billion people. That's when media matters.
So India is a very unique place in terms of social media and misinformation because, one, it has an incredibly high mobile phone penetration. You know, you go into the rural hinterlands, you'll find people holding a mobile phone. And at the same time, it's a country rife with misinformation, and the ruling party has been a very early adopter of how to play the social media game well. The use of encrypted WhatsApp as a basis to target messaging has been perfected to an art by the party. But having said that, given the very tough media landscape right now and the ways in which the ruling party exercises control over traditional media outlets like television channels or newspapers, social media has been a boon for the opposition because it has allowed them to break through to the people who all they need is a mobile phone to be able to see somebody on a YouTube channel and learn something that they would not from traditional media sources. So it's a real mixed bag for the country in terms of rife misinformation that could lead to an ethnic lynching in a moment, and targeted ways to polarize, and a somewhat less educated electorate, but at the same time offers a means to break through when you don't have other choices.
Absolutely, yeah, kind of new ways to reach those.
Exactly.
Yeah. So within those contexts then, about not knowing what comes next and all the rest of it, there was a great comment today I saw from Hitan Shah, of course, the chief executive of the British Academy, who said, sitting there at the AI conference in Paris, the missing topic seemed to be geopolitics and understanding how that fits together. Is that something you think would speak to this idea about kind of shaping that future? Is that something that plays? We spoke there about how international affairs shape the idea of domestic elections, of costs and all the rest of it. Does it shape discussion of technology in those elections? I mean, some stuff crosses borders, some doesn't, I guess. You mentioned podcasts, for example. That's something that really crosses borders in that way and perhaps is a means of connecting that right wing that you spoke about.
Well, I think the interesting connection between technology and geopolitics over the coming year will be how far developed not just DeepSeek, but other Chinese AI large language models that are rivaling the ones that big tech created are. So there was this exciting moment 2 weeks ago where it became clear that a Chinese large language model was about as good as and much, much cheaper, although no one really knows exactly how much cheaper, than ChatGPT. And that was meaningful in a variety of ways. It was meaningful for the big big tech companies that were actually, it wasn't really clear that they had, what tech people call a moat. They didn't have a way of protecting their profits, and big tech have been so important in elections and in politics. Witness Elon Musk over the last 5 or 10 years. That something that kind of pulls the floor out from under them, I think, is worth thinking about. But then, of course, it's hard for any of us to get a good sense of how we should feel about the large language models coming from a country that is still perceived by the West largely as an adversary. In China, right? Huawei were largely banned from the US and unclear about whether they should be allowed in 5G networks here. TikTok was briefly banned in the US and has been discussed here. And now we have large language models. I mean, that just feels like a very potentially tense environment, on top of which all the world's semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. And I suspect that China-Taiwan relations are going to be part of the story of the next 2 or 3 years as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in terms of that, we talked there about campaigns, we talked about technology, we talked about that spread and how we were going to look at these ideas. And I wondered, are there particular campaigns that have impressed you guys? We talked there about the difference between governance, about building cabinets, about pushing policy and figuring out priorities. But that's a very different thing to building a campaign. Or is it? I wondered, is there hope to be had? And then seeing the way that different campaigns have come together. Sarah, I wonder if I could go to you first.
Have I been impressed? I mean, I always do love a good election. So, of course, it's been an exciting year for that. Also we haven't talked much about the UK.
Yeah.
Were people excited about this campaign? So, no, but I think they were one thing that was quite lovely about the British election, which didn't get that much attention because everyone sort of predicted the outcome. But what was quite exciting was sort of democracy at work. People were quite fed up, other people, with the Conservative incumbent party because of, 14 years and so on. You get a kind of change of power in a lovely sort of, Downing Street. In comes the moving van, next morning you have a new government. And I thought there was something quite, beautiful about that. I remember I did this event with foreign journalists. They were like, oh, this is the most boring election ever. And I just thought, this is rather cynical. Like, just because we don't have the sort of, far right taking over or something exciting. I mean, it was a beautiful moment in democracy. You have kind of accountability, throw out the rascals, you give Labour a try, probably they'll be kicked out next time. But, it's democracy at work. It was what you started with saying, everyone is the king going into the ballot box. Was it the most exciting campaign? It was kind of cautious. We're not going to mess up and just let the Tories, but it was still democracy at work. So, because that was the one campaign I experienced, as everyone has also heard, my students and so on, because I was in a 3-way marginal. I mean, there's nothing as lovely as good British constituency policy. I was a swing voter through the whole campaign, and you had to have all these MP and potential MPs come up and stand in front of my door for ages, talking to me. Oh, I really can't possibly decide which way to vote, week after week. And that's, there's something about that with elections again. So I think in that sense, every campaign is a beautiful thing because it gives you, as the voter, the opportunity, and in this case, in the UK. So that's the one I'll pick out.
Pavithra, what about yourself?
So I think, I've started to genuinely believe that we're in a new media landscape that we don't quite understand. And I think voters are consuming political information in a very different way than I think many of our leaders are used to presenting themselves in. And so for me as an India scholar, something that grabbed my attention was the Congress party leader, Rahul Gandhi, doing something very simple, a march across India. It was called the Bharat Jodo Yatra, which is Join India, walk. And he walked the length and breadth of the country, and in doing so met everyday voters. And every visit, every walk, every day became a viral moment. And it allowed, people who now consume information through Instagram and YouTube and Reels to watch a leader in action, which made that a very sort of poignant way to think about a genuine opposition. that moment now seems very fleeting, and I wonder what happened to that Congress party that attempted that a year ago. And in the same way, I think the early days of the Harris-Walz campaign had a sort of authentic energy to reaching voters, talking to them directly, until, again, they turned into somebody who had come out of a lab that makes politicians, right? And so I think leaders are struggling. Leaders who have been culturalized in a different political context are really struggling on how to reach these voters now who are consuming political information in a different way. And in some ways, the phenomenon of a Modi or a Trump is people who have been astute enough to understand very early how to reach those people. And the sooner the more institutionalized parties start to understand how to play this game, the better they will be for it. Because I don't think it's that the world is tilted right. I think it's just that the world is tilted toward whoever's capturing the space very cleverly. And we need those moments of knowing how to reach your voters.
That's a really interesting one, capturing that space. And I think you raised a really interesting question there, but is it that we see personalities, leaders, strongmen, sort of damaging faith in institutions, or is it lack of faith in the institutions damaging the faith in those leaders? There's kind of an interplay between those two things, I think, in a very strong sense. Ben, yourself, how have you seen kind of campaigns that capture that energy and how to play that idea between institutions and personalities?
Well, I think it's worth keeping in mind that faith in the government and the government being able to make people's lives better has been very low for a long time. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, in the US, hasn't really improved since Watergate. It's 50 years, basically, now, of flatlining. So what that does mean is that voters are less confident that any politician's promises are meaningful because they don't trust that even if a politician has the right intentions, that they could make that happen. I think that means that for challenger parties, when they get into power, there is less leeway given to them and less time than there might have been 30, 40 years ago. And I think it's clear that this has been a challenge for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves because they have promised to make things better. That presumably will take time. They spent the first few months of being in government sort of standing at the side of the patient's bed like a doctor, shaking their head at the poor condition of the patient, which was an intriguing governing strategy. But on the other hand, they don't really have to worry about an election for 4 years, or that's what we thought. But I actually think, that old world where people give governments a bit of time, that's over, right? The attacks start right away, and it's true they don't face a general election for that time. But I think the permanent campaign is something that all politicians have to deal with in a world where there just isn't that deference or trust to politicians that will give you a few years.
It's a really important one, of course, and the idea of in Britain we've got the local elections is the next one on the horizon, but then you can see that matters. We talked about Turkey earlier on, and there the kind of municipal elections were what damaged Erdogan, and we saw that kind of sense of it as well. So a useful one there. Now, that's an interesting one about change, about promises, about things that are pressing in that sense. And you can see that perhaps in the reactions to the promise of a Green New Deal in the US, for example. We can see that in the kind of the spectre of kind of green politics across the European Union and reactions to those things. I wonder, when we talk about change, the idea of, kind of reaction to global heating, the pressing idea of climate change is something that's really quite important. Is that something you saw a lot of evidence of across campaigns? Or is that something that, parties have backed off because you can't deliver, like you say, a kind of day one promise to make a big change? What do we think?
In Europe, the last European elections before this one in 2019 were sort of widely seen, perhaps slightly overinterpreted as the green elections, because green parties in a few countries, notably Germany, did well. And that was really taken as a mandate for the European Union to be quite ambitious in terms of the European Green Deal, really going and a sort of consensus across the centre-right, the centre-left, to really push and be leaders globally on climate change. And on that front, of course, a couple of things happened this year. One is that the European elections, and domestically and at the EU level, didn't deliver quite, perhaps, the sort of endorsement of green parties and the centre-left in general. and that I think has created a nervousness around the centre-right. Maybe we should back off a bit on the green agenda. And of course, I mean, most importantly, globally, is the election of Donald Trump that just sort of, kills the US leadership on that front. So it's certainly very challenging, and I think what the populist right that we've talked a lot about tonight is going to do is seeing that alongside issues such as immigration as another wedge issue that once these policies start being ones that people notice, you have to have a new heat pump, you have to change your car, something that's a bit costly and not just lofty ideas, that is something that can be mobilized. This, Richard Tyson, Reform UK famously, it's not net zero, it's net stupid. And they were, focus grouping that this was very much appeal to their voters. So I think that's what we're seeing it already, of course, in the US and elsewhere, but that's something we'll see. I think that consensus will also probably break down in Europe the way we've seen it on immigration in response to the far right mobilizing it.
Okay. Ben, for yourself?
Yeah, I think Sarah's absolutely right. About 5 years ago, there was a convergence of fortune, really, that it looked like you could make an argument that the technologies behind dealing with climate change would also miraculously improve the economies and the investment capacity of the state, and so it was a win-win-win. And I think as a political scientist, you always have to have one eyebrow raised when people say this is really going to be win-win-win. It's proven to take a lot longer than the politicians who espoused the Green New Deal thought it would to deliver. Right? We've spoken a lot when discussing the US elections about the failure of this idea of deliverism, that if you provided new investments and new jobs for voters, they would reward you. There were two problems with that. The jobs and new money barely appeared by the time of the election, and then the voters didn't care. So that's a double whammy. And then the other thing is people, I suppose, mistook a very high level of public consensus that climate change is a bad thing and then net zero would be a good thing. If you look at all British polling, you'll find, probably except for a reform, but certainly among conservative voters, there's a lot of support for that. People mistake that with, and you'd be willing to pay X, Y, and Z for it. Well, if you look at how much the British public claim they'd actually be willing to pay to improve the NHS, our national religion, and then you look under the details and it's like, yeah, sure, I'd pay an extra £50, £100 a year.
It's not enough.
People are not going to put up with paying £50 or £100 to pay ULEZ fees, let alone the kinds of expenses one might really have to do for net zero.
Pavithra, I wonder, that's a really good point, and it's an interesting one, because that, we look at something like the revolt against ULEZ and the idea of people jostling against that. But that's really somewhere like Britain, somewhere like London, where climate change may be felt in some way, but that's nothing on the approach to it in South Asia, especially, where really it's a very different sense of engaging with the problem because it's present. Yeah.
I mean, I was going to answer this question as, climate change was a living, breathing actor in the past election. India had one of its hottest summers ever recorded. And if you were a government trying to keep people away from the ballot box, you couldn't have found a better time to hold elections. Because as we rolled through April and May over those 7 phases, voters faced enormous difficulties standing in queues to, have their voices heard. So in a very real way, climate change was with us in India over those 7 phases of voting. And if things are going to fall apart in terms of treaties over the next few years, that's just going to get worse.
Absolutely.
And this is not for a lack of trying on India's part. I think India has made conscious attempts both at the federal and at the state level to try and bring in climate change, technologies, been one of the leaders in the SAARC nations to adopt climate change policies. But, it's the reality of the lived existence now, and conducting elections in those circumstances is just going to get harder and harder.
It's a really interesting one. I guess it contrasts with the national, international we talked about earlier on, with the idea of how people are willing to engage with those things and the enthusiasm that can really drive it. Now, I want to say thank you very much for answering the questions that people had put to us in advance, but I'm also aware that we brought all these good people along with us, and I'm really certain that we want to actually go out to the audience as well and draw in some questions, if that's all right with you guys. And so, I think we're going to cast out to the audience. We have a, thank you very much. I can see we have a roving mic. We can ask individual questions, we can collect some questions in. I'm aware that we also have someone monitoring the online broadcast who can relay questions to us as well. And so, yeah, I just wanted to cast out to the room. If anyone has any immediate questions they'd like to pose to the panel, then please do raise your hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. What is the outlook for finally doing away with strategic voting altogether and bringing in more ranked choice voting, single transferable vote, proportional representation, and other such? I mean, when will people in these countries, especially the Anglosphere, finally get fed up with the strategic voting and strategic electioneering that first past the post brings? Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we've got a question there about sort of electoral structures, electoral reform. It's a big issue, obviously, in the UK. It's a big issue in France. A lot of people talk about the concept of proportional representation and where it sits in the different formats of election. We heard about 7 phases in India. What do you think around, is there a sort of happy medium somewhere? Is there a kind of a golden mean that can direct us towards this? Or are we trapped in this desperate search for the will of the people and how to define it? What do we think? I mean, if you have the answer, then I think we're in for making a fortune. But what do we reckon?
Just on the British context, which is, of course, the one European country that still has first past the post. Well, who decides that you're going to have a change of electoral system? You know, the party in power. And the Labour Party, of course, at its conference had voted for a change to proportional representation. Then now it managed with about less than 2% increase in the vote share to have an absolute landslide in Parliament. Are you then going to go, yeah, now is the time? No, I mean, that's the thing. It's the parties in power, and there's good good political science studies on why most European countries moved to PR when they did. But just sort of in a parochial British context, I think there's absolutely no incentives for Labour, having just found out that they cracked the code and can have a massive parliamentary majority, then to change it. I mean, that doesn't mean it's a good thing. You know, I'm a continental European by heart, as you can probably hear, so I'm all for PR. But it's just to say that it's the ones in power who decides the rules of the game, and if the rules of the game work for them, they don't want to change it. Right now, actually, it should more be the Conservatives wanting it than Labour.
Yeah, I think the Conservative Party, for the first time in their history, have become PR curious. Well done, guys. Yes, Sara's absolutely right. The person who has control of parliamentary sovereignty is going to be making the decision, and right now there's very little incentive for Labour to do it. But Labour's edge in terms of voting is so slender right now that they could very easily find themselves, after the next election, in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. I think it's much more likely that the Liberal Democrats retain a large share of their 72 seats than that Labour do, of their many, many more seats. And I think that is the instance in which this happens, not least because the Liberal Democrats will not say, gosh, let's have an AV referendum, that worked out so well. I suspect that they would more forcibly suggest that this should be done. How you do it, of course, is a challenge. You know, do you do one of these things where you have a kind of double referendum, or you say we'll do it in the election after next? One thing I'd quickly say about this, so in the book I wrote recently, it was a bit of a paean for PR at the end of it. And then every time I give talks about this in continental Europe, people are like, oh, PR's terrible. Our electoral system is terrible. No one can, all the parties disagree with one another, and they pretend, and it takes us so long to organize coalitions, and look at Germany. And so, there is a kind of tendency, I think, we have to assume that our system produces terrible outcomes and other systems make everybody happy. I don't think that's the case. I don't think we'd all be magically happier under PR, but I do think it would stabilize our politics a bit more so that we wouldn't get the whiplash that I think we've been getting.
It's interesting, wasn't it, that idea of stability and instability? The argument goes both ways, of course. Yeah. Pavithra,
Well, the sort of conventional problem that people articulate in the US and here in the UK is that, the first past the post system artificially makes you pick between two parties, right? Like because of strategic voting. India until 2014 hadn't really had that problem because it was a vacuous multi-party democracy where, your caste, your religion, your class, your region all led to parties sort of creating big coalition governments. And the last 10 years have sort of upended that. And so in India, a different kind of conversation is underway, which is, to hold what are called concurrent elections. And the BJP has made the first move on that because state elections and national elections don't happen in the same calendar. So different states go to elections in different years to hold their own sort of local state legislative, majorities. And the BJP is trying to hold national and state elections simultaneously. So as Sara said, this is a move by an incumbent party to change the electoral rules to help it gain even more power. Because one thing that has helped a lot of federalized parties in the different states is that they really set the agenda for their particular state's issues. And if suddenly it were to be synced with the national calendar, the national agenda would dominate state issues, which would play to the BJP's favor. So we are not in any discussions about first past the post to PR, but they are in discussions about concurrent elections.
I think that's really, really useful, and we can see that in Europe as well, Sara. Like we talked before about the dissolution. Emmanuel Macron was reacting to a different set of elections and then essentially souring domestic politics with this extraordinary overreaction. And so I think that idea of concurrent elections is a really interesting one because that is a bigger issue, isn't it, when you have different systems at play? Yeah. So, I can see we have a question online and then another one there in a second.
So we have two questions from online. The first one is, mainstream media has been more opinion-based and selective. This has changed people getting their news from unethical resources and from social media. Do we think foreign actors have aided the right by controlling the messaging? And the second question is, how can we keep billionaires like Elon Musk out of everyone's politics?
Sorry.
Well, certainly linked questions, perhaps, in that sense. So we have this idea then of, we talked about social media, we talked about new means of communication. How would we come through these and kind of square this circle? How do we deal with people finding new sources of information? And I guess, the question is, Ben, is the Chinese government running your Blue Sky account or whatever? How do we actually understand how people are, legitimate actors in that space? What do we see in terms of that? How would we respond?
I would say to this that it's ever been thus to some degree, right? So I'm in my mid-40s, so I grew up in a country where the Sun set the political agenda for most of the 80s and the 90s in much cruder terms, actually, than the mainstream press do now. Sure. So I don't buy the argument that the mainstream media in the UK has become more biased than it was in the 1980s. Okay. In fact, I think it's almost certainly the reverse. Okay. So that would be the first point I would make on that. Secondly, billionaires have known for centuries that you don't get into fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel, as they say, right? Yeah. It's extraordinarily powerful to control the press. William Randolph Hearst basically got America into the Spanish-American War in 1898 by making up outrages against American women by Spanish colonists. And so these stories are old. It's true they happen faster today. Okay. It's true that Musk is richer than William Randolph Hearst was and can have more power. So maybe the potential of this is worse. I mean, I think everything we're seeing with Elon Musk going through the databases of the US government right now would suggest that we don't want to underestimate the power of Elon Musk. But still, I don't think we want to imagine that our current world is so unimaginable to our predecessors. I don't think it is.
So to come to you then, is it? I think it's a good point there about this idea of it maybe being a process of degree or of pace, perhaps, in terms of that change. Do you see trends of a change in terms of consumption of mainstream media, or perhaps even kind of outside interference from very wealthy people?
Certainly, I mean, There is a large literature on campaign financing, and I mean the US is extreme in terms of just the money that goes into elections. So I grew up in Denmark where, there's not a lot of money in election and it's really capped. And actually the state, something that it doesn't do here, pays parties to campaign, and that's how they're funded. So, I mean, that's obviously not something you're going to be able to turn around in the US to say that. But I do think it sort of makes for better politics that you don't put in the kind of money you have in US politics. So just looking across the established democracy we've looked at and others tonight, I mean, there is a lot of variation in, that's not to say that people with money are not influential elsewhere, but just to the degree to which you can go in and sort of not buy an election, but buy political influence through donations to parties. That's not, the US is the outlier in the Western world as opposed to the rule.
Yeah. Pavithra, what about yourself?
So I'm a relatively recent transplant in the UK, having moved here from the US. And, Ben's already mentioned John B. Murdoch's pieces in the FT. But one thing that struck me living in the UK is the extent to which you consume just partisan news sources is far less compared to the US. Where, your partisan identity pretty much drives which news channel you turn on, which newspaper you read, and just having a much more broad-based media reach in this context already feels like it makes party politics a little bit more fluid, people more willing to be open to a different party as a choice in election after election. And, so that gives me hope for, the ways in which news can reach voters. But the US and India have something in common, which is the oligarchs who own the big media outlets. And when that is aligned very clearly with one player in the political system, that is bad news. So if there's anything India can say about what is coming in the US, it's that pattern of, media outlets owned by billionaires just falling in line behind a party that they think will do more for them than the opposition, and that does not bode well.
No, just self-interest in that case. Yeah, absolutely. That seems fair. No, I think we had a question just here as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about a trend. It seems like 7 or 8 years ago, one of the big things at elections was the difference between sort of the left behind rural areas that were voting for extreme parties, and that it was the young cosmopolitan cities that were trending more toward the left or more toward mainstream parties. And I was just curious, based on what we saw in 2024, to what extent does that still apply to the West in particular? I'm not sure about India, but perhaps there's some overlap there as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. And so for everyone in case you didn't hear, that was a question about centre and periphery, urban and rural politics, left behind and kind of metropolitan populations, and how we can square these. Of course, if we were here, I don't know, a mere 6 hours ago, we might have seen some tractors rolling down the Mall as well. So certainly it's an issue which, isn't just confined to 2024's politics. How do you see that play out, perhaps across Europe?
We see very clear geographical patterns of the ones that you described. Not necessarily left behind in that it's always the poor people in the rural areas or the towns, but they do vote very differently, and especially along what we might think of as sort of second dimension politics, so this kind of big divide between, on the one hand, the populist right, and the other hand, the kind of green parties. There you really see that this sort of liberal progressive bloc really concentrate a lot of their votes in more urban metropolitan, these big cities, and whereas the towns and the rural areas will vote much more for the right and the populist right. So there's clear across Europe, and also, we also see these sort of divides in the UK, and I'm sure others will talk about the US. So that's still very much the case. Some of that is, of course, rooted in other individual levels. Some of it is context itself, but individual level differences that are increasingly driving voting behavior, which is education. So social class is a less powerful predictor in Europe now than it used to be of voting behavior, but education is, and where do a lot of highly educated students, but also highly educated people go? They live in the cities, and that's a big determinant of voting behavior. So I think that's, you're spot on there with that. That's one of the new divides, or not new, but a divide that's important in politics.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah set out the basics of the divide. I think they're broadly correct. I'm trying to now interpret your question as, has anything changed this year? And I think maybe there's been a little change, right? So the Labour Party did quite well in rural areas and is holding a lot of seats that it will almost certainly lose in 2029 in districts that have never voted for Labour. In Liz Truss's district in southwest Norfolk, I mean, there were lots of things going on with why they voted to go south, but they nonetheless did vote for the Labour Party, which is astonishing on a variety of levels. I don't think it will last. The tractors, I mean, Labour decided to pick a fight on a policy that people hate, inheritance tax, with the most organised lobby group in the country, farmers. So good luck with that idea. But I think that's indicative of what we'll see. Mm-hmm. In the US, on the flip side, the Trump campaign did much better in urban environments, and particularly in the Northeast, in places like New Jersey. Actually, even in parts of Philly that people really thought would go towards Harris, actually veered back towards Trump. Obviously, they've done very well in the Miami area over the last 2 cycles now. I think that Trump has managed to pick up some parts of the urban vote that had drifted towards the Democrats for 30 or 40 years. It's not clear there's anyone else in the Republican Party who could win those votes other than Donald Trump. But you know, Trump talked a lot in 2016, 2020 about how he might win New York and California, right, and we all laughed at him. But actually did a lot better in New York and California this time than anybody expected.
Yeah, I just want to second that. And I think Trump did better in suburban and urban and ex-urban than he did in the reddest rural counties. But I think it's still, the jury's still out whether this was because of an actual shift in people's voting preferences or if it was because the Harris campaign just failed to turn out voters to the same extent that the 2020 election did, which was a really bumper turnout year for Democrats. And whether that could happen foreseeably in the future, whether this was a matter of the margins looking better for Trump because fewer numbers of people showed up to vote. And so I don't know what the Trump gains in the urban areas mean just yet, right?
Yeah, it's a useful point because I think it's tough to draw those conclusions, isn't it, in that sense?